Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome back, actually. We have been on pause for the summer, but I'm so glad that you have joined us again. I'm Cynthia Osborne. I'm at the University of Texas at Austin, and we are so excited to have the UT Systems Scholar Series to come back in action. We have been bringing together early childhood scholars from across the 14 University of Texas system institutions to share with each other, to learn from one another, and to begin to work collaboratively together to really try to improve our knowledge about children in our earliest years, as well as their lives and the well-being of their families. And we are so grateful to be joined today by a group of wonderful scholars, pardon me, from the University of Texas at San Antonio. They are going to share with us the really groundbreaking work that they're doing on early childhood bilingual settings, looking at both literacy, environmental education, special education, and we have so much to learn from them. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Maria Leija, who is going to start us off. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Interdisciplinary Learning and Teaching. And we are so grateful that they have joined us today and look forward to what they share. Enjoy.
Good afternoon, I'm Maria Leija. I'm excited to share my work today. The title of my presentation is Exploring Intergenerational Immigrant Experiences Through Children's Literature. Welcome. So immigration, in terms of immigration, there are approximately 5.1 million minors who are undocumented or live with at least one undocumented parent in the US. We know that Texas has the highest population of undocumented immigrants, and we know that societal views on immigration affect families and their home life, as well as their children's schooling experiences. Children as young as 6 years old have knowledge of the immigrant experience, that's been noted in the research, and they bring their personal immigrant experiences or the experiences of their families with them as they engage with texts. The theoretical framework for my study is LACRIT, so I'm really looking at the ways in which issues of subordination based on immigration status, language, ethnicity, culture, phenotype, identity, and sexuality are addressed through the Latino critical race theory framework. And I'm looking specifically at Latinos. And so for my study, I'm thinking about the commitment to social justice that the teachers portrayed in my study, and as well as the ways in which they centralize their students and their families' experiential knowledge. So I'm thinking about their history, their family history, their lived experiences, and the ways in which they create, center the curriculum around those experiences. So the research question for this study is, how do bilingual teachers use children's literature in the US-Mexico borderlands to discuss immigration and other borderlands issues with students? And then how do Latinx students living in the borderlands use their experiential, linguistic, and cultural knowledge to learn about immigration and or other borderlands issues? The methods for this study, this is a qualitative comparative case study. I did purposeful sampling of participants that I met in different ways, and I'll talk a little bit about that. These are both second grade one-way dual language classrooms, meaning that all the students in both classrooms are Latino students. And then both of the studies were collected during the language arts block of the day. So we have one teacher that's in South Texas, and we have another teacher that's in Central Texas. So we have Mr. V in Central Texas. He was born in Mexico. He's been teaching for 9 years. At the time of the study, he was a master's student. That's where I met him. He was at a Title I school, and he had 19 students in his class. The composition of the program that he was teaching in was a 50-50 dual language program, meaning that at this point in time, the students are receiving half of their instruction in Spanish and half of their instruction in English. And then I observed him during the 2015 year from February to March. The South Texas teacher is Mrs. G, and she was born in the US. At the time of the study, she had been teaching for 7 years and was in her second year of the master's program. And this school had been identified as a turnaround school, meaning that it had been failing. And a group of researchers came in to work with the teachers, and we did a survey, and based on the survey, then we selected which teachers we wanted to work with. And so I selected her as the teacher that I would work with based on her interest in implementing using culturally relevant literature with her children. Her students there's 15 students, and this is an 80-20 dual language program, meaning that 80% of the time she was teaching in Spanish and then 20% of the time in English. And the data was collected right before the pandemic from November to February 2020. So just to give you a little overview of the immigration projects, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the books that were read. So we have these books here in yellow, which was the first teacher. Him and I worked together on identifying books that addressed immigration issues. And then we came together and he talked about which books he would select. Same thing with the Mrs. G. She also identified books that she was interested in. And then I brought some in that I was interested in, that I thought would related to immigration, and then she selected the ones that she wanted to use. So both of these teachers ended up using the books in green, and then the books in yellow are the central teacher, and then the books in pink and green are the South Texas teacher, yes. So these are the themes that they had wanted to address about immigration. Overall, they just wanted students to understand that people have an experience prior to immigrating. There's a reason why they immigrate. They go through an immigration process, and then life in the US, what that's like, some of the challenges that they must overcome. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of each of the units, just to give you a sense of the classrooms. So here we have the first teacher, the Central Texas teacher. He ended up doing a 6-week unit. We have the books that he read in Spanish and English. He decided to interview parents. That was another thing that both teachers worked on, is how to incorporate parents' knowledge in ways that were non-traditional. So really thinking about how do we bring parents' knowledge in about immigration. And so they both decided to do interviews, and the teacher, the Central Texas teacher, also decided that the students would interview Duncan Tonatillo, an author of one of the books. And then they did family projects. So he assigned a family assignment, and then by the end of the week, they would submit that work, and then worked on writing, so in different forms. So a thank you letter, a persuasive letter, and then the class book that they created. And this teacher also invited parents to present about the experience of him asking them to discuss their immigration experience at one of the conferences, local conferences. The second teacher, the South Texas teacher, she ended up doing a 12-week unit. It extended to 12 weeks, and did similar things in terms of like interviewing parents and including family assignments throughout the weeks, and then ended up writing a book as well. And so here we see the different activities, the strategies, and so on and so forth, and the culminating event. So overall, identified three themes for this study. So both teachers fostered students' bilingualism and biliteracy through their reading and writing practices. They created new meaning through composite stories of intergenerational knowledge and experiences. And I found that immigration overall was a high impact topic for both groups of students. So first, I will start with fostering bilingualism and biliteracy. Here we have, this is the central teacher, and he's reading Pancho Rabbit and the Coyote. And after he reads the book, part of the book, he asks the students the following writing prompt. So why is Pancho Rabbit, the main character, the only one looking for Papa Rabbit? Papa Rabbit came to the US and then hasn't returned, and so he's worried about him. And so Pancho Rabbit, the main character, has decided to go look for his father. And so he assigned the writing prompt, and then students went back to their desks, and they were sitting at tables, so groups of students at tables. And so we see the following interaction occur as students are working on responding to their own prompt, to that writing prompt. So the following conversation occurs. Alejandra, a student struggling with being able to identify the word dangerous in English. She asks, so how do you say dangerous in English? And I'll read it in English. And then one of the students says, peligroso, dangerous. And so then a student, Gabriel, says, dangerous. So Gabriel is translating the word peligroso for Alejandra. And then Magda steps in and she says, dangerous, using that long A vowel sound. And Yesenia directs her response to Gabriel, correcting him that the word is dangerous. And Magda again repeats dangerous again to Gabriel. So they all want Gabriel to understand that the way you pronounce dangerous, the way you say it is dangerous with that long A vowel sound. And so Gabriel responds, and he again uses that long E vowel sound, emphasizing the R, so dangerous. And Yesenia calls him out and says, nope, that's not how you say it. You say dangerous, holding out that long A vowel sound, not dangerous, identifying the way, pronouncing it the way that Gabriel had said it and letting him know that. And Magda steps in and, Magda misunderstands Yesenia, thinking that it was directed at her. And she says, I didn't say that. And then Yesenia says, dangerous. Okay. And so there's a 10-second pause. And then Alejandra, the student that had been asking for the word, says, dangerous or how? And then Magda says dangerous. And Yesenia breaks it up by syllables, danger. And Alejandra again asks, how do you say it, Magdalena? And Magda says dangerous. And then now we come back to Gabriel, another student, the same student that had been struggling with that sound. And he says dangerous. But then reverts back to that long eval sound, which he had been saying. So dangerous, and then pronounces it again, dangerous. And so I want to show you what happens then, how this translates into writing. So here we have the work of the student that had originally asked for help. And so we see the word, she ends up writing drendus for dangerous, which is what she had heard, the way she heard it at this point in time. We know that bilingualism and biliteracy, right, take time to develop. And so it's going to take time for her to develop and for her to acquire those sounds, the phonology of the language. And so over time, that will improve, of course. But here's just one example of how students in this classroom were able to support one another, were able to draw on each other's knowledge to be able to write in English, which was the goal of the assignment, for them to respond to that English prompt. And they were able to support one another, therefore developing their bilingualism and biliteracy. Next one, we have creating new meaning. So composite stories of intergenerational knowledge and experiences. So here we have two different texts. One, the yellow one that was created in Central Texas, and the pink one that's outlined in pink that was created in South Texas. So in both situations, the teachers invited parents to come into the classroom. They interviewed the parents. And then the teachers decided that based on the interviews of their immigration experience, that they would have students then get into groups. And I talk about each interviewee's beginning experience, the middle experience, and the final experience. And so here we see a group of students doing that. They're talking to each other about that. And then as a class, and they selected the characters setting the plot, and the teacher facilitated the elements of the story and how that story would come together based on parents' experiences and based on the knowledge that students had gained from the text that they had read. And so then they worked in groups to illustrate and color the pages. The teacher typed the stories in both situations, and then a copy was provided to each of the family members. In the South Texas group, they decided that they wanted to share their story with all the other second graders, and so then they had to translate their text into English because that was the language of instruction for the other students. So here we see, I'm going to show you two different pages, one from each text. This is the Central Texas group of students. And we see them that they rely a lot on the parents' experiences. And so here we see, because this was based off the interviews, this composite story, we see the experience of Senora Juarez playing a role here in their text. And so what happened to her is that when she was crossing, she ended up getting a needle stuck from the cactus. And so they write that into the story, that she was no longer able to walk, but her family members helped her. And then they also drew a lot on Pancho Rabbit and the Coyote. They had interviewed him, and so they did talk a lot about how that story and that author played a role in their own development in terms of writing the story, and they identified him as a mentor text. In the South Texas group, we see this book, Two White Rabbits, also playing a role in the story, and so they talk about the human smuggler as a coyote, right, or a chucho. In this text, they identify the human smuggler as a chucho, and the students decide to keep that name. And so here we see the use of the chucho, the animal, as a way to represent that. And so we also see that in the text. And so with the South Texas group, you see a lot of reliance, a lot of mentor texts playing a role into the creation of their own story. We see that they base the story on one child versus a lot of other people. And so there's a difference between how the stories are developed and the focus of them, but they both, and at the end of the day, they both draw on their the interviewees' experiences and the text that they had access to. And then the third topic is immigration being a high interest topic for the students. So here we see a student, she calls me over and she wants to show me, she shows me the ways in which these two texts are connected. So she talks about friends from the other side, and friends from the other side, there's a part in the book in which they are living in shacks. And so she had access to EPIC, a database of books that they're able to read on their own. And so she talks to me about how within this informational text that she has access to, they also have the shacks, or the colonias. And so she's able to make that connection. As you can see, these are second graders. You can see them just looking at the picture, the amount of text, right? But they were so engaged in the topic of immigration that this just continued to be fostered in different ways. And it came from the students. In this situation here, I have the teacher has moved on from what she called the immigration project onto the poetry unit. And for her, she thought, and for me as well, we thought, okay, we're moving on to poetry. And so the students, what I find is that they're continuing to make these connections, integrate poetry with immigration. And so here we have, which was not the intention of the teacher, but here we have one of the poems that one of the students wrote about his immigration experience. He says, I immigrated too. I was hungry. My mom asked someone if they could give her money. We got something to eat and we got to the north. And so we hear his experience, and he's a baby at this point in time, but he's able to share his immigration experience through the unit, and the teacher encourages them making those connections. On a separate occasion, she talks about library days and how students are constantly coming back to the authors of the texts or the titles that they've been exposed to. So here we have a cubby, and we can see the book, one of the books that was from the unit, but then another one, we also have one of the authors. And so when they go to the library, they're asking the librarian, can I please have a book by this author? Can I please have this title that we've been reading? And so I'll just show you pictures of them engaging with one another, stopping the teacher to just show her a connection that they're making. And so we see a lot of engagement amongst the students. In terms of the impact that it had on the families, they talked about how it went beyond, it came back to the home, right? Because the teachers, each of the teachers had a literacy celebration, and in which parents were invited to come in and to talk about their experiences. And so one of the parents shared that this impact that it had on her child beyond the classroom, that this child wanted to know more about her experiences, and how he talked about having papers and what that meant for him being able to take advantage of studying in the US and being able to one day get a good job. And so we see that the topic of immigration, the immigration project, went beyond the classroom. It goes into the home, and that it encouraged their academic performance in school. So we know that through quality literature that is culturally relevant to students' experiences, culture, and language, it can be used as a vehicle for transforming their educational experience and for supporting students in further developing their bilingualism and biliteracy. And intergenerational learning provided opportunities for the sharing of familial knowledge, practices, and immigration experiences between generations, and supported the development of literacy skills. And finally, the immigration composite stories gave voice to the students' communities' immigration experiences. These voice humanized and created safe learning spaces to engage in conversations about the immigrant experience in the current political climate. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Leija. My name is Rika Ramirez, and I will be presenting next. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to everybody. So I will be talking about, hold on, let me move this little thing so I can press the present button. Can everybody see that? Awesome. All right, so I will be talking about reading outcomes of K through 5 bilingual children with DLD. This will be a review. During COVID, I was having trouble getting into the schools, and so a way to be productive was to do systematic reviews. And for those of you who don't know what a systematic review is, it's a review of evidence on a specific question, and you use systematic and standardized methods to select and critically appraise articles that are relevant to that question. And so you use the same methods across all of these articles in order to deem whether they're, first of all, quality studies, and also whether they're relevant to your question. And so then once you have your group of studies, then you extract and analyze data from those data, and then you have a systematic review. I published one recently, language outcomes of young dual language learners and teacher factors, but saw that there was a large gap in the not typically developing bilingual students. So therefore, I decided to, and in partnership with Dr. Huang, who's also a part of this study, we decided to do a systematic review on those who are experiencing some type of developmental language disorder. And so what is a developmental language disorder? It's where children have difficulties understanding and producing language that impacts their everyday life and their learning, but they don't have any intellectual disabilities. And so they don't have a brain injury, they don't have an intellectual disorder such as Down syndrome, but they are still experiencing difficulties in producing and acquiring language. And so this disorder manifests in both languages. And so if you're an English, Spanish speaker, this DLD, these difficulties will manifest in both English and Spanish. And these children tend to learn language at a slower rate versus their monolingual counterparts. And since language is a foundation to learn how to read, DLD children are at a higher risk of experiencing reading difficulties, which was one of the reasons why we decided to do a systematic review on what was out there in terms of the literature. So for this study, we wanted to synthesize research findings on the development of reading among bilingual children with DLD or some form of specific language impairment. The purpose was to inform best practices on identification and inform interventions or treatments for this population. And so this part of the presentation I'm going to go over, and this is the standardization of the study. So the search criteria or the parameters that I set were any articles published in between 2010 and 2021. They had to include young and elementary age students, so K through 5. And the reason being that this is when children start learning how to read. And then they had to be bilinguals, and they had to be diagnosed with DLD or some form of language impairment. And we included all research designs. So we kind of threw out a wide net in our first round of articles. So we included case studies, all the way from case studies to experimental, longitudinal, and as well as qualitative methods. And so in order to cast that wide net, we use keywords, and this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some examples of the keywords that we used. And so we use UTSA databases as well as Google Scholar. And so the keywords that we used was bilingual children, DLLs, ELLs, reading, decoding, reading comprehension, emergent literacy, print awareness, letter identification, as well as DLD, developmental language disorders, interventions, and SLI, specific language impairment. And like I said, this is not exhaustive. This is just examples of the keywords that we used. Okay, so then once we cast that wide net, it went through several rounds of screening of the quality as well as the relevancy of the articles that we found. So they each were looked at, and I'll show you exactly how the step-by-step is how we did it. Was it had to be primary research, it had to involve human participants, it had to have at least one assessment of children's literacy or reading skills. And like I said, bilingual children had to be included, and they had to have a diagnosis of DLD and or speech language impairment. And then it obviously had to fall within the correct age range. So this is the flow chart, kind of a visualization of what we're doing. Our first round of inclusion, in our UTSA database, we saw 309 articles, and our Google Scholar was 380. We removed duplicates, and therefore our first screening was 676 articles. And you're probably wondering, oh my gosh, that's so many, and it was. But we're only looking at titles and abstracts at this point. So it's a cursory, does it fit or does it not? And so 630 articles were excluded based on relevancy, and therefore 46 were actually where we sat down and read the full article top to bottom. And through those readings, we excluded 41. And the main reasons for exclusion were either they didn't assess any type of reading, or they weren't bilingual, or there wasn't any type of obvious diagnosis of a speech language impairment or DLD. And so surprisingly, there was only 5 articles that were included. Now, the previous previous systematic review that I did, there was 21 articles. And so at first we were just kind of wondering, did we do this right? And so we had a consultant come in, and Dr. Lisa Bador, and she agreed, like, this is how the literature is out there in terms of reading and DLD and bilingual children. It's a very specific question, and there's not much out there. And so that calls for definitely a need for more research in this area. So we found a huge gap in the research, but we'll go over what we found. So this is the sample of the 5 articles that we found. And as you can see, they are very varied, which is great that's one of the benefits of systematic reviews. You get to see a large picture of who's doing this type of research. So we have 48 Latino bilingual children in kindergarten. We have French English children in kindergarten. And then we have a large data set on over 1,000 bilingual children ranging from the ages of 6 to 9 with 35 languages reported. And then we have bilingual children with 19 languages reported in that study. And then another 63 Latino, Spanish, English bilingual children in kindergarten. So very varied in the sample that we saw. And then some of these, the reading tasks that were assessed, and this is not an exhaustive list, these are just examples: word and letter ID identification, pseudo word or non-word repetition, real word reading tasks, decoding, reading fluency, and then the use of dynamic assessments, which is a pre-test, teaching, and post-test of non-words. So really looking at the learning potential of these children. And then there was also uses of standardized tests, which DIBELS is a common one for literacy. So this is preliminary in nature. We just completed our final round of screening, and so and we're working on a write-up right now. So these are the themes, the 3 real big takeaways that we found in our synthesis, is that diagnosing developmental language disorder, or SLI, among ELLs is challenging, and the recommendation is using tasks that measure perceptual cognitive skills. And so for an example is word and non-word reading tasks rather than the language heavy tasks that we're accustomed to, such as standardized tests. And so if children are struggling with language, having a language heavy task won't tell you very much about their difficulties in reading. And then also screen reading and language difficulties using their L1, their first language, their home language. And you can do this as early as kindergarten to screen these types of difficulties. And I think that goes even with those who are typically bilingual, typically developing bilingual, is using assessments in their first language. So that shouldn't be anything new to us. And another thing is dynamic reading assessments were found to be very promising in detecting reading difficulties. And this is another, this shouldn't be a surprise either in this group of people who probably do a lot of research with bilingual children, and dynamic assessments have been found to be very, very beneficial. And if people don't know what dynamic assessments are, it's a method of conducting an assessment which seeks to identify skills, but also their learning potential. So that example of the pre-test, the teaching, and then the post-test is a great way of seeing the learning potential of children. And the last big takeaway is the difficulty in rapid naming and working memory are predictors, have been found to be predictors of DLD, regardless of whether they are bilingual children or monolingual children. So looking into rapid naming and working memory is really important in these children. And this is the references for the 5 articles that we included in this review. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me when we get to do the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ramirez. And welcome again, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. I will go ahead and provide a link to the recently published article that I'll be sharing today. So I did that. I'm closing the chat and I'm sharing. So welcome again, everyone. This is a presentation based on a study related to environmental education for toddlers and their caretakers, a context for language development. My name is Maria Guadalupe Arreguin, in the Early Childhood and Elementary Education Program at UTSA. So this research was based on 3 key questions. One has to do with elements of nature that young children are spontaneously drawn to in the context of environmental education. And I also looked at what elements of nature are adults also spontaneously drawn to as they interact with nature. The third question was looking into exploring opportunities and challenges for the use of contingently responsive language during a bilingual Starting Out Wild workshop with young children, specifically toddlers at a nature park. You might have heard about biophilia as a theoretical framework, and I used it because it just made sense. We tend to be drawn to theories that align very closely with our beliefs, and biophilia it proposes that we are naturally inclined to associate with nature. We tend to look for nature. We feel better when we are surrounded by nature, and we realize this even more with our present circumstances. So that's biophilia, and Wilson has a definition, and a whole description about what it means. So just keep this in mind as we go over the study. My interest began when I began reading about the connections that other scholars made between nature and the cognitive domain. When we are in the middle of nature, or such as taking a nature walk, the idea is that that nature acts as a stimulus, and we begin identifying objects, we begin wondering, we want to understand what happens and why it happens. And so that's a very complex activity that we engage in. Most of this comes from Elizabeth Lawrence, and she labels this activity of thinking in the middle of nature or in the context of nature as cognitive biophilia. We're basically growing cognitively when we interact with nature. So based on this, in this 2015 research, I extended that understanding of cognitive activity to include language. And that's where the term linguistic biophilia came from in this work and subsequent articles. So when we think of nature, my interest was in looking at how can nature, including all organisms and aspects of nature, support language development in young children. And so thinking about this, we saw an opportunity at one of the local parks in San Antonio with which we have a partnership. And this park organizes different workshops. One of them includes toddlers and their caretakers. This past 2 years ago, we noticed that more and more Spanish-speaking children were joining the program and wanting to, have their children learn about nature. So based on this opportunity, we designed an environmental education workshop in English, in Spanish, including children who were English proficient and Spanish proficient. So half of the workshop, was in English and half of it was in Spanish. We had a very purposeful structure, and we asked parents to participate in different ways and be systematic about their interactions with their own children. And so we provided cards with scripts that they could use to point to organisms based on the theme of the workshop. So the topics of the workshop included grass, butterflies, spiders, and leaves, each one on a different day. We collected photographs, mainly because, as we know, the best data collection method with children is observation. I know that someone is raising the hand, but we'll make sure to address all questions when we come to the conclusion of my presentation. And so this was a qualitative study looking at instances in which children and adults paid attention to elements in nature. Our goal was to identify opportunities for language development and also challenges. We wanted to know what were children mostly drawn to as they immerse themselves in the nature walk. This environmental education program is not new. It has been in place since 2013. In fact, one of my doctoral students conducted research in this context as well. And we've been trying to learn ways to capitalize on children's natural attraction to animals and living things. As you can see, we had a busy schedule, but it was appropriate to their attention span. So 15 minutes of an introduction and singing, another 15 minutes of a nature walk, specifically asking parents to use vocabulary that was relevant to the experience. And we also followed that with a craft and then a closure. So we were also looking at fields of promoted action, meaning we had a plan for, what organisms to look at, and all at the same time, making sure that we followed children's lead and their interests. Because we know that, learning in early childhood for young children follows a certain direction. It goes from concrete to abstract. But even then, what makes the difference is when children, when the discussions revolve around topics that are at the center of children's attention. And so we were very careful not to intervene, to let the activities follow a natural flow. I took notes and photographs. We were looking at children's spontaneous engagement, learning from what represents an affordance, meaning what objects afford a connection, what organisms afford being observed by children and adults. And we thought that identifying these objects and organisms would teach us then for subsequent plans, as we looked at, okay, so we are in the middle of a park, but we can't be the ones driving the structure. We should inform this with children's natural activity as they engage. And so when we look at question number 1, looking at elements of nature that children are spontaneously drawn to and initiate episodes of joint attention, meaning they call their parents, they call someone who was near them and wanted to share something or pointed to something. Overwhelmingly, we noticed that they prefer insects over plants or any other object. If an insect was present, they wanted to observe, they wanted to touch, they wanted to stay there. And this is important because one just has to wonder, when do we stop being curious and attracted to insects? And I say this because when it comes to adults, it was very different. And here you see the intent with which this little girl is observing the beetle. Well, that was a common occurrence across the workshops. And it might have been an insect that was not part of the workshop, but we make sure to let children guide us towards those organisms and then take advantage of that to produce language. And I was mentioning earlier that for adults, it was a very different story. They were mainly attracted to plants. So in a way, playing it safe, wanted to observe something that, you know, was pretty, was near, but was close. But also in doing so, trying to draw children's attention towards these plants that they were not naturally, walking towards. And when you think of, teachers, in adults, but I mentioned teachers because this is important. This is an attitude that we transmit to children, this rejection and aversion to insects. But there's something that happens along the way as we grow up, that we acquire attitudes, and it's most likely from other adults in our lives. And so thinking about what we learned and the challenges that we encountered, we noticed that as much as we plan in the context of nature, we tend to think that because it's an insect, it can be the topic of a workshop, but it may not afford contact. It may not be responsive, such as one example I have is one of the workshops revolved around butterflies, but it didn't work because we couldn't find but one, and it was so far away. And so then we had no real opportunity and proximity to produce language that helped us grow in relation to that topic. So very important, to think about this. And here we have it. The spiders, gave us no sensory experience. The butterfly either. But as you saw, the beetle, which, the little girl found, gave us plenty of opportunities for sensory experience, close observation, opportunities for discovery. So we learned that we should be purposeful as we bring opportunities to interact with nature and look for those affordances, organisms that are responsive, that allow a movement of both the child in connection to this organism. And of course, always making sure there's a balance of guidance and discovery. We feel that, only those readily available affordances can potentially spark engagement. And this is congruent with an approach that is generative and allows growth in all domains, including the cognitive. But in our case, we were looking at language, and the opportunities for language development are endless once we guide ourselves by informed observations. Well, thank you, everyone. And I guess we follow with Dr. Alanis.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Araguin. I'm Dr. Ileana Lanis. I am professor of early childhood and elementary education in the Department of Interdisciplinary Learning and Teaching at UT San Antonio. And these are my colleagues. And we thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. And what I'd like to do is facilitate the Q&A portion. So you can continue to type in your questions into the Q&A box. I'm going to start with Dr. Leja because we've had several questions that, and I'll ask Dr. Arguin to stop her screen share. But Dr. Leja, can you talk to us a little bit about the frequency of critical readings as part of the curriculum in these two teachers' classrooms? And so how frequent were the critical readings? And if they were not frequent, why was that?
So there was certainly a difference between both teachers when we look at the ways in which the literacy skills were developed through the use of the children's literature. So the Central Texas teacher, he identified a reading skill that he wanted to work on, but he never like he incorporated it, but always allowed students to go beyond that. So if they and would name what they were doing. So for example, in one situation, a student is predicting and then he's making connections and then he's inferring. And so he was very intentional about, focusing perhaps on inferring, but then he encouraged a lot of peer talk. And so like think, pair, share. And so students who knew who their partner was for having these discussions during these interactive read alouds. And so he would ask a question, they knew who to talk to, they would talk to each other, and then he would bring them back and he would ask for students to share. And so he was very open about like I said, the reading skills that they were focusing on and then naming what they were doing so that other students could then hear the strategies that were being used and be able to see that connection between the strategy I'm using and what we're reading, the discussion that we're having. Whereas the South Texas teacher at the turnaround school, she was very focused on the strategy that she would focus on for that day. And she would incorporate the children's literature, but it was all structured around, let's say, for example, making connections to self. And so then she would have like a worksheet that went along with it. She would model the use of the strategy. And so whereas the other teacher was very open, intentional about the strategy, but open as to where students went, they didn't necessarily have to have like a follow-up activity with the strategy that he wanted to focus on. The South Texas teacher did. She was intentional about it. And so when I analyze the discussion that students had, I noticed that whereas the central teacher allowed students to go beyond it, that provided opportunities for other discussions, especially critical discussions that students were having, whereas the other teachers tended to bring them back and say, let's focus on the strategy we're using today. And so then that kind of limited the opportunities for critical discussion. And so I saw more of the critical discussions occurring when parents came in to be interviewed. And so, and once even her own mother came in to be interviewed for as one of the interviewees for the South Texas teacher. And so during those situations, there was definitely more opportunities for critical discussion about why people had immigrated or about what had happened to them during the migration and the process of immigration, and students bringing up, well, that's not fair. Why do we have borders, so on and so forth. And so there's certainly opportunities and spaces for critical discussions, but it did vary depending on the intent of the teacher of the lesson.
Thank you. Dr. Arguin, a couple of questions for you. One is really, and I'm just going to kind of group these, is that what can teachers do, right? What strategies, or adults, what can teachers do? Because you talked about the significance of language in these environmental and outdoor activities. So what can teachers do as far as strategies to really augment young children's language development? And you're going to want to unmute there.
Yes. So yes, concrete strategies that teachers can use to promote language development is to use specific vocabulary that is very closely aligned with what's drawing the child's attention, right? And not be afraid to use complex language. What we would say, is sophisticated language. Well, it should be sophisticated, and it should be rich, and it should be descriptive, because it is in the context of that context embedded activity, that children will acquire that label, right, for what they don't know. And another strategy that we propose, both in this workshop and in our work, including work with Dr. Lanis, is extending children's utterances, and by doing so, we validate and we give them that role of conversational partners and modeling language that is very descriptive, but it's also analytic and extends their repertoire.
Dr. Ramirez, I'll come around to you now. So now that we see, the paucity of literature that's available, what are next steps for researchers looking at children with developmental language disorders that are also in the bilingual population?
I would say that looking more into that naming speed, rapid naming and working memory, and how that can be used as predictors of DLD. I know there was a question about whether I could speculate about what that means and what that means for DLD, but I think that would be a good start since we have found that already in the literature. And in answer to Sarah's question, naming speed is associated with DLD in that it is a good marker of language impairment and the growth rate of grammar. And so that could be a good marker for DLD, as well as working memory, because working memory is a way to process and manipulate information. And if you're struggling with that process of reading and decoding and syntactically complex sentences, then your working memory would be a good marker of future DLD or late emerging DLD.
Thank you. Dr. Leigh, I'm going to give you this opportunity for the very last question. Really, how did teachers navigate these challenging discussions, and how did they help children express themselves and about what was happening with them and their family?
Yeah, so for both teachers, it did stem from their desire to teach in culturally relevant ways. So thinking about Latino critical race theory, right, my framework, they both were committed to social justice. And so they really thought about, like, well, how can I do this through the curriculum? Your work, Dr. Lanis, talks about the importance of culturally relevant literature and students being exposed to that and the academic benefits of having that exposure, of that engagement with culturally relevant literature. We know academically it supports them in so many ways and develops their academic skills. And so I think part of it is about their pedagogy, right? Do I believe in social justice? How do I enact that through my curriculum? How do I incorporate that? And then both of the teachers were intentional about parents understanding, like, I'm going to cover immigration. So prior to even beginning the discussion about immigration, they both sent out letters and stated what they would do, that they would invite them in for interviews if they were, if they were open to it. Please let them know that they would have family projects to discuss this. And that way, both teachers drew on family knowledge in non-traditional ways, right? Usually we see parent involvement as parents coming in and helping students read or making copies, so on and so forth. But this was done through the students. So the students were a bridge for that. And as well as the parents, some of them coming into the classroom and being interviewed. So I think a part of it is, what topic will I cover? How will I cover it for these teachers? And part of my research does focus on how do we incorporate families' knowledge in non-traditional ways. And so thinking about how do I use my curriculum as a way to get there with students. And so I think letting parents know early on what you'll be covering, keep staying informed with them, thinking about how do I incorporate that knowledge into the classroom, are ways to have these critical discussions. And both teachers talked about, like, immigration is, it's part of their lives. As the research shows, it affects them. It affects their family's life. It affects their schooling experiences. And so both teachers talked about the importance of creating that space within the classroom. For the second teacher who was beginning it.
just because of our time frame, I'm going to stop you there, Dr. Leah. But we just want to thank all of you for participating with us today, taking time out of your busy days. I want to thank my colleagues for taking the time to share that incredible research with us. We appreciate you and the work that you're doing, and we hope the rest of you have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.